Hey there, Philip the Librarian here. Today we're going to talk about the novel Infinite by Brian Freeman. Infinite takes place in Chicago. The main character is a man named Dylan. Dylan works as an events manager at a hotel, and he just lost his wife Carly in an accident. They were driving, the car went into the river. He survived, but she drowned. And he feels terrible because he thinks he should have been able to save her. But he also thinks that something else is happening because just as he collapsed on the riverbank, he saw a man who looked just like him. I'm going to admit that I didn't like Dylan very much. He's not a bad person, but he's kind of bland and unpleasant, and he doesn't really seem interested in making the world a better place. As a kid, he watched his father kill his mother and then commit suicide, and then later, Dylan got in an accident where he lost his best friend, Roscoe. So, I feel bad for Dylan, but other than that, I don't feel much of anything for him. He's in a lot of pain, but he doesn't really do anything interesting with that pain. And the story doesn't get started until other things start happening to him. Things pick up when murders start to occur, and Dylan suspects that his doppelganger is actually the one committing them. You see, at his hotel, they have a guest speaker named Eve Breyer, who published a book about a multiverse in which infinite possible versions of a person occur, and Dylan realizes that a psychotic version of himself is running loose across other dimensions. The story gradually focuses on the conflict between Dylan and the alternate Dylan who feels nothing and wants to kill with impunity. This alternate Dylan is a monster, an abyss. He's like a xenomorph from H.R. Giger. He loosely resembles the eponymous double in Dostoevsky's short novel The Double, so to avoid confusion, I'm going to refer to the evil doppelganger as Dvoinik, the original name of the Dostoevsky novel. Dr. Breyer talks about how there are different dimensions where Dylan is a different person because of different decisions that he made. She says that he can travel to these other dimensions by taking this weird sedative from her and then submitting to her hypnosis. His body stays here, but his consciousness travels to other dimensions. It's best if you don't think about it too hard. When Dvoinik frames Dylan for the murders he just committed and then vanishes, Dylan asks Dr. Breyer to help him to travel to these other dimensions so that he can stop Dvoinik from killing more people. Then it gets even more interesting. Dylan winds up in one of his favorite places, an art museum filled with his doppelgangers, except each of them is a little different from him. He follows Dvoinik out the door, and then both end up in another dimension where yet another Dylan exists. Dylan, the main Dylan, watches this alternate version of himself, and later yet another version of himself. With each version, Dylan sees how this Dylan made certain decisions that affected his life. As this happens, Dylan starts to examine his own decisions in life, and he actually considers trying to steal one of the other Dylan's identities, but he knows that wouldn't be right because he needs to find a way to live with the choices he has already made. Ultimately, this is a story about a man coming to terms with his own past. He wants to see if he can live with his mistakes without trying to deny them. Dylan realizes that he has been blaming himself for the deaths of his parents and his best friend, and he has tormented himself so much that he isn't able to open up to other people or appreciate what he still has in life. His wife's full name is Carly Chance, a very subtle hint that she was his last chance at being a decent human being, and he still blew it. The problem I have is that we, as readers, should already know from the start how this conflict is going to play out. We know that Dylan tormenting himself is never going to lead to anything, and we know he'll figure this out eventually because he's not an idiot. The only question is when. We know that opening yourself up to the world is 1,000 times healthier than constantly living in the past. So, the conflict is one-sided. The author is more interested in how the story plays out than why. The story has a lot of neat plot twists, and moments of self-realization and lessons that we can relate to. Honestly, I did not care much about any of the characters. I felt bad that regular Dylan lost his wife, and I wanted to see regular Dylan make it out alive, but he's not a very unusual character, and I never saw him do anything that affects society as a whole. Actually, I sort of do at one point, but it's a different Dylan, and we barely got to know him. Also, this is pretty subjective, but I didn't like the writing itself very much. It's dry and self-important, mostly humorless, taking everything too seriously. Freeman spends several paragraphs describing women's appearances, their skin, and their clothing. I'm not calling it sexist, it just felt like filler. This book could have done a little bit better with a sense of humor. The novel has two central images, with the stars representing infinite possibilities and a flood representing being stuck in one place. Dylan is indeed drowning in self-reproach and grief and regrets and frustrations. Every once in a while he looks up at the stars and they give him hope. I thought the dual symbolism of this novel was a nice touch. I've never read Brian Freeman before, but apparently he got the idea for this book from The Magus by John Fowles, one of the few novels that I actually could not finish because I really could not get into it, mostly because I downright hated the main character in that book. I think Infinite is a better novel than The Magus. It's more focused, it makes a lot more sense. What detracted from it was that I have seen this dualism motif in so many other works, like A Wizard of Earthsea and Dostoevsky's The Double, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, even in movies like Princess Mononoke and The One starring Jet Li. This was a cool story, but it didn't create anything new. It just showed us the process of one guy trying to pick up the pieces of his own life. There was almost no sense of world building in it. And if I'm going to read a novel about an entire multiverse,
of endless possibility, where a single choice can branch out into infinite realities,
then I can't help but expect something ambitious and groundbreaking. And since it was not groundbreaking, then I'm left with a relatively unchanged variation on an old, tired theme. So, I do recommend Infinite, kind of like the way I recommend watching the movie Edge of Tomorrow. It doesn't explore all the possibilities that it opens, but it's still a great thrill ride. So that's my review of Infinite by Brian Freeman. Do you agree with my assessment? Do you disagree? Leave a comment below and feel free to subscribe. This is Philip the Librarian, signing off.